The next person to talk to us is Dr. John Gerrard, who's written a book, Gerrard Winstanley, The Diggers' Life and Legacy. Told you earlier, special offer this evening, available for £8, signed, down from £13.99. Actually, the price over there says £7.8. If you really want your 20 pence, you can have it.
Give him a free badge.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
John Gerrard comes from Newcastle, came all the way from Newcastle today to talk to us. Apparently he teaches. Is that right? He does some teaching. People are always so modest, aren't they? He does some teaching at Newcastle University. Anyway, we're delighted to have him here this evening. We're going to spend about half an hour talking about his book, basically. The reason you ought to buy it is 5 mentions of Wellingborough. It's not often you can say that about a book. Even the history of Wellingborough doesn't have 5. John's going to talk for about half an hour, and then if you've got any questions, you can deal with those. And then you must buy his book, because he's going to sit over there and sign it for you. Special offer, £8 or £7.80 if you're feeling really tight. John, please yours.
Thanks. So the band have set up a microphone here, so I hope you can hear everything. If you can't, if there's a problem, I'll either talk louder or come down onto the floor. But I'm delighted to be here to help celebrate the Wellingborough Diggers, and I'm very grateful to Jackie and the ISW comrades for inviting me to speak. It was on 12th of March 1650 that the London bookseller George Thomason obtained his copy of the Wellingborough Digger Declaration. This broadsheet, with which many people here will of course be familiar, and I think there's a facsimile for sale on the stall, isn't there? Was published in London by the radical printer and bookseller Giles Calvert, and it set out to explain why the poor inhabitants of the town of Wellingborough had begun to dig up manure and sow corn upon Bearshank Common. The names of 9 diggers were appended to the declaration, which was published not only on behalf of these subscribers, but also of the hundreds more that give consent. The Wellingborough Declaration is the one document produced by the town's diggers, and the only one of 2 produced by digger communities outside the movement's Surrey heartland. It's an important document, both for what it tells us about social tensions and conflict in the Wellingborough region in the aftermath of civil war, and for how it helps illuminate the ways in which digger ideas spread across the southeast and Midlands. So who were the diggers, and what were they doing in Wellingborough? The digger movement was a product of England's years of civil war and revolution, that extraordinary period which saw a massive upsurge in radical thought and concerted challenges mounted against existing hierarchies. Among the many radical groups which flourished in this period, the diggers are perhaps the most interesting and the ones that speak most directly to us today. Any account of the diggers must, of course, begin with one person, Gerrard Winstanley, or with Stephen and Claire here, it's got to be Winstanley, I must remember that, as anyone from Wigan would tell you. And also one place, St George's Hill in Surrey. The digger movement was the brainchild of Winstanley, a bankrupt former cloth merchant living at Cobham in Surrey. It was he who, of course, on April the 1st, 1649, led a small group to occupy waste ground on St George's Hill and to sow the ground with parsnips, carrots and beans. They declared the earth to be a common treasury for all, without respect of persons. And they expressed their hope that all poor people would come to join their venture. St George's Hill, or George Hill as they always called it, would be just the start. Soon similar colonies would, they hoped, take off in other parts of England and across the world. There was no need anymore for buying or selling or wage labour. Monetary exchange was destined to disappear, as was private property. All would eventually come to work the lands in common, and society and the earth itself would be restored to perfection. It's no wonder that many have seen Winstanley and his fellow diggers as England's first communists. Their activities were little known before the 1890s, when several political activists and scholars, including the German Marxist Edward Bernstein, began taking an interest in Winstanley's writings. Soon there was widespread interest, Edwardian land campaigners sought to emulate their occupation of the common lands, while in the 1940s, anarchists thought they had discovered in Winstanley a leading libertarian thinker, and communists a no-nonsense materialist and supporter of state action. In more recent decades, numerous activists, from the Haight-Ashbury Diggers and Digger Action movement of the 1960s, to 21st century environmental activists, G20 and student protesters, participants in the Occupy movement, freeganists, allotment campaigners, guerrilla gardeners, social entrepreneurs, and I'm sure a whole load more, have drawn parallels between their concerns and those of the 17th century diggers. And Leon Rosselson's World Turned Upside Down, which was so movingly sung a few minutes ago, has very appropriately become one of the best known of international protest anthems. In Surrey, the diggers faced frequent violent assaults, and in August 1649 they left St George's Hill and regrouped on the Little Heath in the neighbouring parish of Cobham. There they remained until the 19th of April 1650, when their opponents, led by the Reverend John Platt, mounted a final assault on them, tearing down and burning their homes and destroying their household goods. The movement had lasted just over a year, which is quite impressive when one considers the many hardships that they'd been forced to endure. Throughout the months spent working the Surrey Commons, Winstanley produced an extraordinary range of manifestos, declarations, and political and theological works, each of them designed to justify the diggers' activities and to encourage others to follow their example. The Surrey Diggers also sent out emissaries in support of their activities and to spread their message. Their efforts were, it seems, in part rewarded, for by the spring of 1650, news had reached Cobham of attempts to establish digger colonies elsewhere. Wellingborough was among the first, but there was also mention in March 1650 of another colony at Cox Hall in Kent. By the 1st of May of that year, diggers were at work in Iver in Buckinghamshire, and these diggers knew of others who were active in Barnet, Enfield, Dunstable, in Bosworth Old, which they said was in Northamptonshire, but it's often thought it may have been on the Leicestershire-Northamptonshire borders at probably Husbands Bosworth, and also in unspecified places in Buckinghamshire, Gloucestershire and Nottinghamshire. Several of the towns and villages where digger activities began taking place, including Wellingborough, had been visited by the Surrey emissaries. And we know that Winstanley's writings were being circulated among radical groups in the Midlands at around this time. Anyone who's familiar with Winstanley's works will appreciate why they had such appeal and why digging should have spread so far beyond Surrey. Winstanley was, by any account, one of the most original and engaging thinkers of the 17th century, and most scholars would now acknowledge too that he was one of the great prose writers of his day. There are many features of his writings that are striking. Winstanley was a religious writer, but his ideas would have been troubling to most professed Christians in the 1640s, some of whom, like many later commentators, suspected that he was, at heart, a non-believer. From an early date, it's clear that Winstanley's was an extreme example of a religion of conduct, one that focused on behaviour towards others rather than on any individual path to salvation. The existence of heaven and hell were consequently of little concern to him. It was actions here on earth that mattered most. God, he believed, should not be seen to be, quote, in some particular place of glory beyond the skies. He was in every creature, the spirit within you. Winstanley soon began using the word reason in place of God, for, as he put it, it is reason that made all things, and it is reason that governs the whole creation. And if flesh were but subject thereunto, that is to the spirit reason within himself, it would never act unrighteousness. The spirit reason, he argued, doth not preserve one creature and destroy another, but it hath a regard to the whole creation, making every creature to be an upholder of his fellow. And so everyone is an assistant to preserve the whole. All were amenable to the spirit reason, and all, even those who initially appeared most recalcitrant, would be touched by it. Christ was rising in his sons and daughters, and soon everyone without exception, would be persuaded to act righteously towards each other and the creation. And I think this is the essence of Winstanley's thought. Winstanley was, of course, influenced by the millenarian excitement of the age, an age that saw great institutions in church and state collapsing, the humbling of the mighty, the public execution of a king, and the abolition of monarchy. But his millennium was essentially an internal process, Christ rising in each individual and teaching them to act righteously towards one another, rather than the literal event which so many at the time were expecting. For Winstanley, drawing no doubt partly on his own unhappy experience of business failure, covetousness was at the root of all the world's problems. And the rot had set in with the rise of private property and buying and selling. This, for him, could be easily equated with the biblical fall. And the restoration of all things would come about when humankind was freed from these bonds. Thus he envisaged a world in which public storehouses would be freely accessible to all, and no one would have to work for wages. Poverty and inequality would cease, and the spirit of community would govern the creation. Initially, it would be the poor who led the way by digging and planting the commons and refusing to work for hire. But it would not be long before all came in, the rich presumably being left with little choice but to abandon their properties once no one was left to work them. By the time Winstanley had published the new law of righteousness, the foundation text of the Digger programme, he'd come to realise that talking and writing were not enough. Action, as he put it in one of his most memorable phrases, is the life of all, and if thou dost not act, thou dost nothing. It was this conviction that led him to George Hill, for my mind was not at rest, because nothing was acted. Now, Winstanley and his fellow diggers were certainly good at publicising their activities, and this helps explain why their ideas spread. But there are clearly other reasons too for the digging to reach Wellingborough and elsewhere. One, I think, is that Winstanley appears, at least in part, to have been very consciously addressing a particular constituency, one made up of radicals who had departed from the existing church and who had found no convincing alternative in the many new sects that appeared in the 1640s. They included seekers, those who rejected all forms and all existing churches, but also disillusioned or so-called broken Baptists, a significant number of whom were to be found in the East and South Midlands. Many of such people would, later in the 1650s, be won over to the new Society of Friends by itinerant Quaker preachers. And it's surely no accident that Wellingborough, like several other places where digging took place, was an early Quaker stronghold. The Wellingborough Quakers' chief persecutor, whose name appears again and again in Quaker tracts and sufferings registers, was none other than Thomas Pentlow of Wilby, the Justice of the Peace who brought the town's digger experiment to a speedy end. A second and equally important reason for the spread of digger ideas was Winstanley's skill in addressing the pressing needs of the disenfranchised poor. Among them, those whose livelihoods had suffered badly in the years of war, and who feared that the Civil War victors had little interest in recompensing them for their losses. The immediate post-war years were ones of scarcity, as the economic dislocation brought by war was exacerbated by a spring of poor harvests. In many parts of the country, including London and Winstanley's hometown of Wigan, extreme distress was reported, with people said to be starving in the streets. In Northampton, in December 1647, the town's assembly voted to raise £100 to set the poor to work. It seems that similar orders were later made for Wellingborough, where, as the Digger Declaration put it, there were as many as 1,169 persons in one parish in receipt of alms. The local JPs, had they claimed, ordered the town should raise a stock to set the poor on work, but nothing had been done to put the order into effect. Now, the link between digging and the alleviation of poverty was once dismissed as far-fetched. For many years, historians tended to play up the religious and symbolic aspects of the Digger programme while playing down the practical. Any suggestion that digging was a form of social conflict or an attempt to mobilise the poor was seen as naive or, as was often said, proof of left-wing bias. The diggers were, more often than not, portrayed as idealistic outsiders who descended upon unsuspecting rural communities, only to be swiftly driven away by angry locals whose common rights said infringed. What conflict there was mostly said to be between the diggers and the local community, rather than within the local community. Research more recently has, I think, shifted the picture significantly, because we now know that a great many diggers came from in and around the parishes where they set to work. They weren't outsiders. And this is certainly the case in Surrey, where several diggers, including the most active, were from the parish of Cobham, which is where Winstanley lived. It was the local poor which he wanted to recruit to his cause, and I think in this he does seem to have succeeded. In his writings he always drew very successfully and very skillfully on traditional languages of social protest, and he made much of the unfairness of a post-war settlement that enriched some while impoverishing others. And part of his genius lay, I think, in his ability to bring together the languages of religious radicalism and popular protest in ways that no other radical of the time ever managed to do. And it's clear that it's in the inhabitants of the parishes where the diggers set to work, many of which had experience of landlord-tenant conflict, that it's these people who are most amenable to his message and most willing to brave the elements on the commons. And the local origins of the diggers is something we see too in Wellingborough. All but one of the 9 signatories to the declaration can, it seems, be traced in the local records. Their social and occupational status is what one might expect to find. Some were labourers, there was a glover and a blacksmith, and so on. One, James Pitman, may have been a shepherd, an occupation which, as we know from a 1612 libel, was popularly associated with Bearshank Lees. And it's significant that none of the diggers whose names appear in the hearth tax in the 1670s had more than one hearth. They were, it's pretty clear, among the poorer inhabitants of the town. Several of the Wellingborough diggers, like their Surrey counterparts, had young families and would therefore have been particularly hard hit by high prices and food shortages. We see this with Joseph Hitchcock and Richard Pendred. Both of them had children of 1 year old or less at the time of the digging. And when one looks at the Wellingborough parish records, these names appear. There are young children, again and again in each case, in almost every case with the signatories, they do have the big families they claim, they have young children. And all of this, I think, would support the claims of the Wellingborough diggers that they were driven in their actions by necessity. Several of them, they claimed, had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 in family, and we cannot get bread for one of them by our labour. We have spent all we have, our trading is decayed, our wives and children cry for bread, our lives are a burden to us. And to suggest, as some still do, that the actions of the diggers were always primarily symbolic rather than practical does, I think, seem slightly baffling, to say the least. We also know that the Wellingborough digger venture attracted a degree of sympathy from the townspeople, as was the case in Cobham. This too would seem to link the digging to the needs of and concerns for the local poor. The Wellingborough diggers mention 3 prosperous inhabitants, Mr. John Freeman, Thomas Nottingham and John Glendon, who had freely given them their share in the common. And farmers were also said to be giving them seed to sow. Each of the 3 named individuals was well known in the town and featured often in the town records. One, it seems, later became a Quaker. We can't be sure whether any of the Wellingborough diggers themselves became Quakers, though it's possible that Richard Smith was one, although of course that's a common name. But a Richard Smith of Wellingborough was involved in a dispute with Thomas Pentlow in 1655, after he and a fellow Quaker, Francis Ellington, had been assaulted by a Findon woman who threw water, stones and dirt at them. And Quaker activity in Wellingborough continued apace in the 1650s, with church services frequently disturbed and several Quakers dispatched by Pentlow and others to Northampton Jail. And interestingly, there is a copy of the Wellingborough Digger Declaration to be found among the Society of Friends records deposited in Northamptonshire Record Office. And I think what the digging and the early Quaker activities do tell us is that Wellingborough was very much a divided town in the 1640s and 50s. And we can see this too from its Civil War experiences. As many people here will know, the town was caught up in December 1642 in fighting between the local inhabitants and parliamentarian forces from Northampton, and many of the townspeople were plundered. And some extraordinary detailed accounts of these events have survived, describing, for instance, the struggle over the access to the church bells, because a backward peal would be the sign for royalists from neighbouring parishes to rush to the defence of the town. And the death of the unfortunate bystander Jacob Flint, curate of Harrowden, struck down by a blow from a parliamentarian soldier's poleaxe. And the best-known story, that of Thomas Jones, the town's elderly vicar, being forced to ride to Northampton on a performing bear, was apparently only added later to the narrative. Despite Northamptonshire being, as a county, being seen as overwhelmingly parliamentarian during the Civil War, Wellingborough does, and I see people who may disagree with me, but Wellingborough seems always to have been regarded by both sides as being more favourable to the king than to Parliament. And when deciding where to plunder, Royalist forces were said to distinguish carefully between the parliamentarian region between Wellingborough and Northampton and the Royalist area between Wellingborough and Kettering. The consequences for Wellingborough of the Royalist Rising of 1642 included a shift in power in the town, as those who had been compromised in the Rising were removed from office to be replaced by more committed parliamentarians. And the influence over the town of neighbouring parliamentarians, such as Thomas Pentlow of Wilby, also increased. Thomas Jones, having been ridden out of town on the bear, was succeeded as Vicar of All Hallows by the Puritan Thomas Andrews. There seems to be no love lost between the new authorities and the town's common people, who were suspected of having taken a leading part in the 1642 Rising. When radical ideas began to spread in the town I think it's really with the rise of the New Model Army you see the spread of radical ideas in Wellingborough. When these appear, it was very much among the common people that they first took hold. There were complaints as early as 1646 that Andrews' services were being disturbed by soldiers and townspeople, and his life was apparently threatened. More and more people began turning away from the state church and listening to the various radical preachers who passed through the town. Wellingborough soon developed a reputation as a centre for radicalism, and it may have been no accident that William Thompson, the Leveller mutineer, made his last stand in a wood just outside Wellingborough in 1649, possibly Sywell Wood. I think that's the one that's often mentioned. So the scene was clearly set: a divided town, the spread of radical ideas, food shortages and so on, for the appearance of diggers in Wellingborough in 1650. The diggers were, as we know, on Bearshanks by 12th of March, when their declaration appeared, though they may of course have been there for some time before that. Their declaration, I think, drew very directly on Winstanley's writings, and some of the passages may have been suggested by him. There are very close similarities too with the later Ivor Declaration, which was almost certainly modelled on Wellingborough's. In both, as with the Surrey Digger publications, the same distinctive convergence of religious radicalism, egalitarianism, and concern for the necessitous poor was to be found. Also interestingly, I think there are echoes in Wellingborough, which you don't find in the other Digger manifestos, of the so-called Midland Rising of 1607, the anti-enclosure riots, some of which took place quite close to here, but there is a surviving declaration from that period where some of the same kind of language that you find in the Wellingborough Digger declaration can be seen. Now, the Wellingborough Diggers were mentioned in Winstanley's An Appeal to All Englishmen, which was issued on the 26th of March. On the 4th of April, 4 diggers, at least 2 of them from Surrey, were arrested in Wellingborough after a long journey through towns and villages where they'd hoped to solicit support. Pentlow must have taken action very soon after this, for on 15th of April, the Commonwealth's Council of State thanked him for his proceedings against the levellers in those parts. 9 diggers were apparently charged, but acquitted at the Northampton Quarter Sessions on the 16th and 17th of April, but they were apparently kept in jail. The account given later by the Ivor Diggers suggests that some 30 or 40 people had come to Wellingborough and burned down 6 or 7 diggers' houses and goods. And this is what was to happen in Cobham. It's not absolutely clear that they're referring to Wellingborough. It could be that they're talking about Cobham and warning that this is likely to happen in Wellingborough unless anything is done about it. reading it again, I mean, it does seem as if they are talking about something that has happened on Bearshank Common. Thereafter no more was heard of the Wellingborough Diggers, though one of the diggers, Roger Tews, was to be married before Justice Pentlow in 1654. Penslow and Thomas Andrews would continue to be troubled by Quakers and other sectaries until Andrews was deprived of his living after the Restoration. The Penslow family fortunes would soon disappear in an unusual and unexpected manner. For Thomas Pentlow's heir, a wealthy Smyrna merchant, married a Greek woman, and the Ottoman Empire decided that this made him a subject of the Sultan of Turkey, who was able to lay claim to his estate when he died. The story of the Wellingborough Digger experiment was largely forgotten before the 1890s. Too late, it seems, for Winstanley Road, which was probably named after the engineer Henry Winstanley rather than Gerrard. But I may be wrong, I don't know. I mean, I think that was around in the 1880s, and no one knew of Winstanley at that time, and they wouldn't have, I don't think they'd have made the link with Wellingborough, but perhaps we should keep quiet about that. We have, though, the annual Diggers Festival, a worthy memorial to the Wellingborough Diggers. Wellingborough's diggers reminded all who would listen that the earth was made for the use and comfort of mankind. It was never given to any sort of people, that they should have it all themselves and shut out all the rest. It seems clear that the diggers' message, as well as their example, still has great relevance for the 21st century. And perhaps we also need a memorial to them on Bearshanks Common.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.